true because I want to still have that test on a week from Wednesday. And so we want to have as much of Friday and Monday and part of Wednesday on respiration. So at the end of the last class, I had talked about the bolus making its way down the esophagus, which had the unique histology as described for you. As it enters, I guess I should have really shown this more like. As it enters the upper portion of the stomach called the cardiac, this is kind of a holding place. And if the stomach is full, it'll sit up here for a little while, but will then make its way through. And by the time it exits through the pyloric sphincter, it's passed through the fundus, the body, and the pyloric region. And it's going to be acted upon like a blender. The big job is not, as we said, to be the most important part of the intestinal system. Its job is to turn the bolus into a malt consistency, which is called chyme, not chyme. So the stomach is modified to act like a blender. It has a third layer of muscle. Some muscle goes circular, like mentioned before, some's longitudinal, and now the oblique goes like this. Plus in there are going to be some big folds like accordion pleats. So if you're an itty-bitty piece of hamburger and you get stuck between the folds of the rouge, and you got 3 sets of muscles squeezing at you in different directions, it's going to get mechanically pulverized, which is what's got to happen. You have to get these down to small entities so that and liquefied, so you're going to pour a lot of stuff into the stomach to thin it out. Now, also lying in the mucosa layer will be a bunch of gastric glands. The openings into them will be called the gastric pits. And this is like a test tube. Each of these cells makes something. Some of them make mucus or mucin, called the neck cells, right up here. Some of them scattered around here will be called parietal, and some will be called chief. You don't have to identify them. You just need to know that they're in the gastric gland and that this is what they make. The parietal cell makes the hydrochloric acid that keeps your pH at around 2. And intrinsic factors, abbreviated IF. The pepsinogen is made by the chief cells. Pepsinogen is an inactive protein breakdown kind of enzyme. It's inactive. Okay? Make sense? So you have to know that. And this is going to be the chemical reaction that happens in the stomach. All these other things are physical things. So if you mess with the movement of your stomach, you're going to mess with all of these abilities. If you take a medication that slows down your peristalsis and your mixing motion, you'll have an effect on what exits the stomach or how long it takes to be in the stomach. If you take antacids, you're going to have an effect on how much hydrochloric acid. All of these things are important. So, if these enzymes, or inactive enzymes in this case, happens to be in the stomach, the pepsinogen has to be turned on to be effective. That is exactly why the hydrochloric acid and the intrinsic factors go over the arrow. Without these, it will not be turned on. And this turned on enzyme is going to act like the enzyme substrate complex, and is going to chop those proteins that you've eaten in the hamburger into small fragments. Not two amino acids, just small entities. So you can see chemically it's important, it does stuff, but it doesn't do the most important stuff. The lingual lipase, where did that come from? Came from the mouth, from your salivary glands. But it didn't work there. Why? The pH was not correct. But now all of a sudden it finds itself in the 2 pH and it blossoms, it loves it. It's its optimal pH. It then is turned on, enzyme substrate complex, and some of the fats then are broken down into their component parts. These are the end products of fat digestion, fatty acids and glycerol. Now, not every speck of fat is going to be acted upon. This is just minimal. The best place for the breakdown of fat is going to be the small intestine. When in doubt, small intestine. Okay? Duodenum, most important part of your digestive tube. Now, it's important that your stomach be controlled, since you're not eating 24/7. Some are. Unfortunately, I did watch that 600-pound person again. Oof, I don't do that very often. It's just nothing on television whatsoever. Not that that's any better. But that person ate 24/7. At 650 pounds, they have to be eating a lot during the day. But most of us, at least when you go to bed, you're not eating. And so we know our stomach is turned on sometimes, turned off. And a normal person will have a phase or stages that control digestion. And they're called, these are the 3 phases of control. Cephalic, gastric, and intestinal. When I was a kid, I lived in Minnesota's cold, and I can remember barging into the kitchen door, and if I was lucky, my mother might have baked some cookies or something. Certainly wasn't my dad back then. My mother was baking cookies. Well, the smell of the cookies and the thought, man, that got stomach juices flowing. And that saliva starts to flow. Just think of something really good. And that's called the cephalic part. And that is what starts to get the gastric juices to flow and the saliva to flow. Now, if you don't eat the cookie, it comes to an end. That's why they say if you never have the first bite, you're sometimes better off. So, you succumb, here's the cookie gets in and it touches the lining up here. The lining up here happens to be called mucosal lining cells. And the physical touching is what starts the gastric reflex. And it makes cells that are embedded in the mucosa. These are cells called, they're called G cells. There's a lot of, these are cells now. We talked about the G protein, correct? Not to be confused. These are called G cells. They release a hormone called gastrin. Now, you just studied hormones. These are one of the gut hormones. This goes over here and starts to tell these cells to start releasing gastric juices. I had to laugh a long time ago. I had a student when I said, these G cells release gastrin. He raised his hands in the back of the room and he says, does that have anything to do with the G spot? I hope not. Whoa. So, see, there's a G spot, there's a G cell, and there's a G protein. Don't get them confused. It's not on a test anyway. Okay. So, the gastrin's job then is to help make more gastric juice because after all, you succumbed and the food is in there. It makes its way through now and all kinds of things happen to it. And here it is, it's knocking at the pyloric sphincter and it's saying, get out. Well, as the peristalsis waves increase somewhere around 50 millimeters of mercury pressure, that's going to open the sphincter so that just a few milliliters comes out at a time, not the whole thing. And they too will touch some more mucosal lining cells similar to the G cells. It makes more gastrin. That's the intestinal, because that means you still have more stuff in here. So keep making it for a little bit longer. You following me? Make sense? So then eventually when the stomach is empty, it has moved further down the small intestine. There will be other lining cells then that say, now I'm sure the stomach is empty, so shut down the gastric glands. That hormone, for the most part, is going to be called CCK. CCK stands for cholecystokinin. Cholecystokinin, CCK. And there's also going to be another hormone group of hormone called enterogastrones. Now I put up on Moodle, I opened up a kind of a handout on some of these hormones and enzymes. You might want to take a look at that. So, when you first think about food, the cephalic is controlled up here. As you actually eat and touch, it's the gastric. As it exits and touches, it's the intestinal. So this starts, this maintains, and this maintains. But in time, it's turned off by enterogastrones and CCK. Okay? All right. Sure, no questions? Yes.
What are the three kinds? I can't read them from here.
These? Yes. That's the cephalic I mentioned, gastric, and intestinal. And it's discussed as such in your textbook too. Somebody else? Yeah.
CCK turns off
The stomach. It turns, it actually says shut down. Physically and chemically. Okay, yes.
What is that word all the way to the right side
At the top,
Yeah.
this says fragmentizing. Or fragmentize. It just means it chops the proteins into smaller entities. Okay, you're welcome. So, now, not a whole lot's happened to this chemically. We started carbohydrate, we started fat, we fragmentized proteins. We did nothing to the nucleic acids, but we turned it into a liquid called chyme. And the pieces are itty bitty, hopefully. Now, it starts to enter the upper portion of the small intestine, the duodenum, and it has a whole bunch of features that are unique, but I'll give them to you in a minute. But right now, as it makes its way, at the very beginning, the duodenum is only about 12 inches long, the most important part. When the food starts to move along, there will be an opening into that tube, and this is called, this is a sphincter, circular valve, and it's called the sphincter, they used to call it, and I guess they still do, the sphincter of Oddi, for the dog. But this is a valve that's going to squirt into the duodenum substances made from the pancreas and bile, which is made by the liver and stored in the gallbladder. This enters through the sphincter of Oddi. This is the duct coming from the pancreas. It goes back behind right here. You can't see it. So here's the pancreatic juice right here. It pools in this region called the ampulla. The gallbladder allows bile. So the two of those things, substances, will be squirted into the duodenum. The lining of the tube itself, the mucosal lining brushed border cells, will also be putting a bunch of stuff so that that chyme, which is like a malt, becomes watery. The secret to absorption and digestion is the turning of that into watery substance. You got it? Make sense? Questions? Because what I'm going to put on the board now is what stuff comes from the pancreas, and then what stuff comes from the lining of the intestine itself. Yes.
What did you say the area was that the bile enters?
The bile and the pancreatic juice pool together in the ampulla, and it is squirted through this hole called the sphincter of Oddi. Okay? So I'm going to put over here, I'm just going to erase this and start. I'll put the pancreatic juice right here. PJ for short. And then we have thymogen. Thymogen granules. Whoops. Procarboxypeptidase, chymotrypsin, and trypsin. Chymotrypsin. Is that right? Okay, so as the PJ enters here, this is going to act upon the remaining fat, causing it to become fatty acid and glycerol. Nuclease is going to act upon nucleic acid to turn them into nucleotides. Amylase is going to act upon carbohydrates to turn them into dextrins or disaccharides. Bicarbonate ions will be put into that juice because it's going to act upon acidity. The stuff coming from the stomach is very acidic, isn't it? We have to neutralize it, buffer it. And then finally, the zymogen granules consist of trypsinogen, procarboxypeptidase, and chymotrypsinogen. This will not be acted upon until this is inactive. It will not do anything until it gets into here. Because if it did, it would break, it would act upon the protein of the ductwork and destroy your digestive system. So what this means is, once it gets into your intestine, because you make this enzyme by your small intestine, this acts upon this to turn this on. This then goes over the inner road. these two enzymes are going to act on not on amino acids, but on dipeptides. Oh, I know, protein, pancreatic peptidase. Pancreatic peptidase. So like, let's say you have an NH2 group on an amino acid, and you've got two of them put together, amino acid, and then you have a carboxyl group over here. If this is two amino acids, a dipeptide, it has to become one in order to be absorbable. So what's going to happen is carboxypeptidase is going to chop it off here, and the chymotrypsin is going to chop it off here. And so when you're all finished, you produced separate amino acids. So the pancreatic juice is very important for the breakdown of protein, because as it left your stomach, it was just fragments. It could not be absorbed. And so you have to make sure that you have zymogen granules. That's what makes it so difficult when a person has pancreatic cancer, because what they're doing is removing the source of that. And what is that person supposed to do to break down food after they remove the pancreas, the protein? They're going to have to take all their protein in as amino acids. They can't have it in any complex form. So what I have to do is to put a list of what is coming from the lining of the small intestine itself, and a few other things that will finish the job. handout that's up online, so just pay attention to what I'm saying, and for recording, it's better to just do that. Now listen. The small intestine, yes,
Yeah, I have a question. What does pancreatic amylase mean?
it acts upon carbohydrates to turn it into dextrins or disaccharides.
Thank you.
Okay, so the entire small intestine, the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum are one long tube. And it varies histologically, but you don't have to know the variations. But you do need to know that it's lined by simple columnar epithelium, and that the cell has an extensive microvilli surface, which is called brushed border. And in those little microvilli, it'll be stuffed full of enzymes like these. They're the last ditch effort to break down the food. And the microvilli are important because they increase surface area tremendously. The large intestine has a wide diameter, but it doesn't have nearly the surface area as this tiny little tube does, because each cell has microvilli, and not only that, the mucosa is put into little undulations called villi. And when you got a long sheet of villi going like this, if you dig deeper and move up like this, you're going to have your cells a mountain with hills with microvilli. So isn't that a tremendous surface area? And you've got to have that for this to be successful. So, as the food comes out of the stomach as the chyme, it's going to touch the cells right here, the ones that make hormones. Two hormones that will be produced other than the gastrin we already talked about for the stomach is secretin and CCK. These are regulatory. These are enteroendocrine cells. Products. Enteroendocrine cells make hormones. If this, every time you eat, you don't eat the same stuff. Sometimes, you have a mess, You've eaten unbelievable stuff, good, bad, and indifferent. And sometimes all you're doing is milk toast and something like that. So, what comes out of the stomach varies from day to day. Your lining cells have to say, do we get out the big guns or do we just relax? If what's coming out of the stomach is high in acid, which is usually an indicator of tardy heartache, secretin will be produced because it's going to go over for a point. Where is it going to go? Where is that secretin going to go? If that, yes. And do what?
It is going to break down of our biocarbonate ions.
It's going to do what to them?
Make them less.
They're going to make it and put a bunch of bicarbs in the pancreatic juice to buffer and neutralize, isn't it? Now, if the stuff comes out and it's a little fatty, which is also an indicator that it's got a lot of protein, that is going to go to the pancreas as well. And it's going to say, put a lot of lipase in there. It's also going to say, put a lot of protein breakdown enzymes in there. That's what it messages. But it's also one other thing. Sometimes the stuff is not ready to come out. It's not been processed enough. So CCK, mark my word, has the ability to cause a reflux, sort of a reflex. It tells peristalsis to go in this direction. That encourages it to stay in the stomach. It's called enteroendocrine reflex. Enteroendocrine reflex. So that CCK is very important. And ultimately, at the end of it all, it tells the stomach to shut down. So it wears lots of hats. It's also going to tell the amount of bile released to be increased, because bile will be working to cause emulsification of fats. Emulsification is not on in your definition. Make sure you look it up. I'll say more about it later. So let's say you're making secretin, you're making some CCK, and the food is now being all mixed up by a special kind of movement. The kind of movement in the intestine is called segmentation. Some people also use this word for the colon, but I prefer to use it only for the small intestine. For this reason. If the purpose of the small intestine is to get all of those foods down to their basic steps, it's important that it have be turned over. You've got to touch the lining of the small intestine to be effective. Think of this. Let's say you got a piece of boudin. Everybody can picture that, right? And think of the covering on the boudin is the lining of your intestines. Got that in your mind? Went to Don's, got a big piece of boudin. So, if you want the core, the center of that piece of boudin to touch the walls of it, are you going to get it by just letting it go like this on down? Don't you have to? Well, what do you do if you want to have a garden? Do you just till the first 2 inches? Or do you have to get a spade and flip it over and try to get 6 and 7 inches down here up on the top so it can, get to the sun and the water and whatever? That's really segmentation is called spading. It's the way in which the muscles of the wall work so that you can get everything that's in the middle core out and around. So everything in that piece of boudin can be acted upon by enzymes and become thinner. Is that making sense? The word segmentation is like spading in the garden. In 318, I had a fill-in question one time, and I said, what's another name for segmentation? Of course, the word should have been spading. Somebody put spaying. And I thought, whoa, that's a new way to do it. Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, spaying is making dogs unable to have offspring. Yes? Well, no. CCK is what causes the stuff in the duodenum to go back into the stomach. What's going to make you throw up has something to do with your skeletal muscle. This is smooth muscle. You can't do it. Throwing up is happening because you've got skeletal muscle up here, and you've got a vomit center in the medulla oblongata. And that vomit center is what's told that it's time to get rid of what's in there. totally unrelated. Okay? So it's important for you to make a list. Make a list of what's in pancreatic juice. What's coming from the lining of the tube. What's coming from the liver. And then figure out how does all of this stuff end up getting your nutrients down to fatty acids and glycerol, amino acids, monosaccharides, and nucleotides. So, this acts upon sucrose, maltose, lactose, carbohydrates, fat. What does this act upon? This acts on trypsinogen to turn it on, right? This is not going to digest anything. This is preparing trypsinogen. And then, of course, we have dipeptidase acts upon 2 amino acids. Mucus is produced by goblet cells, the mucus glands, and the ones in particular that you find in the duodenum because of the acidity are called Brunner's glands. That means you go to the textbook and you look in the back of the book for Brunner's glands. And then note that all along the small intestine, you have a bunch of shallow graved glands. That's why they're called crypts, like, you know, cemeteries. Lined with cells, including a cell called pannus, that you might want to look up. But these are the glands that make all of the extracellular fluid that's necessary to turn this into watery stuff. You need to know what each of these does before all is said and done. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of review this on Wednesday. We're going to